The first thing that breaks when you move to another country is so small that you almost miss it. But if you don't catch it early, it turns into the reason that everything starts feeling confusing for you later. I remember that exact moment that it happened to me when I was in a colmado. I was gonna pay a bill on my phone, and I started thinking, not because I didn't have money or something at the time, but because I didn't know which account that I should be using. I had my US account, then I had my Banreserva account, and I had already moved money earlier that week. And for something that should have taken me like 10 seconds, I was sitting there doing a whole bunch of mental math. And I was thinking, like, if I send it from here, how long is it going to take? If I use this card, what's the fee going to be? Did I already account for rent, or how is that still moving? And, that was the first warning sign for me. Nothing had broke, nothing had went wrong, but something that used to be automatic, it wasn't anymore. There's no auto pay and stuff. If you don't notice that moment, things will start to run away from you. Because after that, it didn't just stay in just one situation. It started showing up in other places too. You check your accounts, you have money, but you can't clearly say like how much you actually have available to use, because it's all split up across different accounts, different banks. It's got different currencies, there's different timing that you have to go by. So it's just all different, some of it feels useful or usable, I guess you can say, but some of it doesn't, and if you ignore that, you start making decisions without being clear-headed. Small ones first, but then later on it turns into bigger decisions. I remember trying to think about saving money and realizing that I didn't even know where it made the most sense to keep money anymore. Should I just leave it in the United States, or should I convert it to Dominican pesos? Should I just leave it in the country that I'm in? What happens if I move again? I got to convert back to dollars and I just get less money? What about my taxes? And that's when the small problem turns into a bigger one, because now it's not just about paying a bill. Now it's about not being sure what direction that you're moving in. And this is where, people usually go one of two different ways, and I'm going to break that down for you. So some people, they'll actually try to fix it by tightening up their budget. They'll use more accounts, they'll do more tracking, they're more, how do you say it, closed in and protective of their money. They have more effort focused on their expenses, and trying to force that old feeling of control, back into your life. But it never actually really comes back because the environment just isn't the same. And then you have other people that just do the complete opposite. They stop thinking about it. They use whatever works in the moment for them, whether it's Remitly or Western Union, the ATM, whatever. I swipe right now, I'll do a withdrawal, transfer that, and, I'll figure it out later. And that feels fine until, later on, and now you're dealing with something bigger than where it started. All the fees and everything like that, because what that first moment actually represents is a loss of connection. Because back in the States, or your home country, whether it's Canada or wherever, Europe, everything worked together. Your income, your bills, your savings, your future plans, they were all a part of one environment. So even if you weren't thinking about it, it just made sense. But when you move internationally to another country, you lose that connection. And if you don't rebuild it intentionally, you end up managing pieces instead of the whole foundation. That's why a small moment like that, matters a lot. Because it's not because it's a big problem by itself. It's just that it's one of those first signs, like, okay, I really need to, clarify and set up my foundation of how I'm going to run things here. You know, nothing is automatically connected just when you move to another country. And if you miss that and you don't notice that change until you're already inside it, where your money starts feeling unclear, or planning ahead doesn't feel certain anymore. It's hard to plan ahead because you just don't know what'll pop up. If you can't tell that you're actually going forward in your life, or you're just maintaining, most people don't go back and trace it to that first moment. They just feel that confusion, but the way that it started earlier on, something small, something easy to ignore, like sitting in a cold model or a cafe or something, or a library just trying to pay a bill, or going through your phone or whatever, and just realizing that it's not as simple as it used to be. The point of this video is just to give you a heads up that make sure you have a structural foundation as far as how you're going to manage your money, what accounts that you're going to use, etc., and build a budget, because you don't want to be in another country, midway through a couple months later, and then trying to figure out what your routine's going to be, what your budget's going to be, and how you're going to manage your money, because that stuff creeps up on you, and it creeps up on you fast.